Meditations with Ryan Slomak.
Hello and welcome to episode 45 of Meditations. I'm your host, Ryan Zlomek, and this is a show dedicated to making space for conversation with interesting people just to see what we can learn along the way. And I am beyond thrilled to have two writers in one voice today. I've got Daniel Handler on the show, and if that doesn't mean anything to you, Daniel Handler is also Lemony Snicket, the writer of the A Series of Unfortunate Events books, which ran for 13 volumes and just blew up the children's writing market. It was turned into a 2004 movie with Jim Carrey, and then a television show that ran for 3 seasons, both of which Daniel Handler had the fortune and misfortune of writing on, as we'll hear about in this interview. Though he's known for A Series of Unfortunate Events, Daniel is also a remarkably prolific writer who has worked on The Basic Eight, All the Wrong Questions, Adverbs, We Are Pirates, and his latest memoir, And Then What Else, which details his adventures in writing. But he's also a phenomenal accordion player, even if he downplays his talents, and somebody who can be found in cafes all across San Francisco while he writes on his yellow legal pads just to sort of get the creativity and the narrative out there and see what stories he can create. So without further ado, let's run into this awesome multi-narrative conversation with the one, the only, the duplicated Daniel Handler and Lemony Snicket. Mr. Handler, Mr. Snicket, Mr. whatever other secret pen names you have out there, I really want to thank you for being on the show. One of the things that I find fascinating, and I tend to always start this way with my guests, is just the relationship for geography and creativity. And you're somebody that I very much associate with San Francisco. You grew up there and you've chosen to reside there. And I'm curious, like, what it is about the city of San Francisco that kind of has gotten its hooks into you and has made it a place that you want to call home.
Oh, well, I mean, I am probably a too big fan of San Francisco. I've been known to occasionally sit with someone and say, like, you can't get this anywhere else in San Francisco, and they'll say, that's Earl Grey tea, Daniel. You can get that anywhere. Um, but for me, I think the most wondrous part of it is that um, beautiful natural settings and urban settings are all crashed together. So just about whatever neighborhood you live in San Francisco or whatever neighborhood you are, there is a small untouched bit of wilderness someplace. Not necessarily a planned park, but kind of a scraggly rock you can climb to the top of. Um, there's lots and lots of beaches which are more or less deserted because they're not anyone's stereotype of a California beach. Um, there's lots of woods that you can just kind of walk through. And I find that really appealing. I find being near kind of natural beauty to be important, but then I am the sort of person who wants to see a lot of natural beauty and then like, let's go for Thai food. So it's it's great. And then I think for the more expected reasons too, that San Francisco is really culturally diverse and it is served as a kind of haven and sanctuary for all kinds of people who at one time or another thought they could not quite fit in what so many other places were offering. And I like that feeling. I like the feeling that um, to be made unwelcome in San Francisco, I think is relatively rare compared to many other places. Um, so I like that feeling. And these past few years have been super challenging for San Francisco in a variety of ways, and so some of what I love about it has been battered about a little bit. But I really really love to live here. I love to live here.
That's awesome. So I guess sadly Earl Grey tea probably did not originate from there, but Full House did, or at least, the story. But I'm curious about like if you can give us just a moment of San Francisco tourism, like what are 2 or 3 things that if we get there, you can only have it there, you can only experience it the true San Franciscan way.
Oh, I mean, when I take someone to San Francisco who I'm trying to impress, there's a really there's a stretch of beach that's called unimaginatively Ocean Beach, That's kind of gray and blustery most days and good for walking. And then there's a Vietnamese crab restaurant that's right there. And so you can go and have Vietnamese crab. That would be maybe one kind of evening that I would do. I have another evening in North Beach where there's a couple of picturesque kind of old school cocktail bars. Probably my favorite is Specs, which offers a cheese plate, which consists of a hunk of red wax covered Gouda cheese and like a square wrapper of saltines and a platter of hot sauce. And then armed with that and a cocktail, you can cross the street and go to City Lights Books, and you can buy books that the lure of a cocktail will make you feel, something you've always wanted to read, something that seems really ambitious and strange, but you're fired up with cocktail and with hot sauce, and so that is it. And then just about every morning, I swim at the Dolphin Club in San Francisco, which is an old WGA building right by the sea. And there's a locker room and a sauna. So you put your clothes in a locker and you go swimming in the bay. And then you come back in and you take a shower and you sit in the sauna. And it was opened in the 19th century. So it's a fun old place to sit. And it's deeply San Franciscan. It's not a touristy place at all. And so that's something else. If the person is brave enough or strong enough to withstand the cold, that's something that I take people to do too.
Oh, that's wonderful. I can just feel everybody looking up their Travelocity portfolios right now, trying to get some tickets to San Francisco.
Great, yes. Well, it's still legal to travel.
Yeah. So we'll just let that sit there for a second.
Yeah.
Moving forward, like I want to stay in San Francisco a little bit longer. You're born to Sandra, who's a college dean, and Lewis, who's an accountant. You in a lot of interviews, you talk about discovering your sort of love of reading and just becoming a voracious reader as a kid. And I'm curious about like what the culture of reading was like in your household growing up.
Well, my parents were both readers, and they, they modeled having a book with them, if they needed to go wait someplace, and that you just could never, in my household, you couldn't say that you weren't reading a book right then. There was always a book you had to be in the middle of at least one. And they they were full of suggestions for me, and we went to the library a lot, and we went to bookstores sometimes. But they also just had a whole lot of books, and they never said anything to me about content at all that I have any memory of hearing. And so I would just pick up books from my parents' shelves, wondering what they are, and read them. So I read a lot of things that I was too young for, not so much content-wise, but just kind of language-wise and understanding-wise. And and so I think I learned that early too. I think I learned the kind of challenge of the tough read of like, let's not give up. Let's keep reading these sentences until we figure out what's going on. Um, but yeah, we weren't, I mean, my parents were not in the arts, but they were big fans of it. And they put a lot of culture in front of me and my sister. And the bookish culture I took to very, very fast and very, very hard.
Were they writers at all? I mean, it's fascinating because you and your sister both became published novelists. So, like, were they
Yeah,
ones that were creating stuff?
they were not. I mean, my father, I think, kind of had a creative urge that was frustrated. He was an accountant. He had a very traditional office job. He went downtown every day. Um, but when we would go to the beach on a vacation, he would do this thing where he would gather up kind of sticks and occasional bits of garbage, and he would make a sculpture kind of as high as he could, but pretty impressive for those things. And as my sister and I grew to adolescence, we would become kind of docents, and we would explain to passersby in the kind of headiest language we could imagine what it was that my father was building, and explained kind of what it symbolized and what it meant. Um, my mother grew up playing piano, so she played piano a little bit. She and I would play duets sometimes or something like that. But we weren't an arty household. We were a cultured household and an educated household, but we weren't in the process of making something. Um, and my sister came to writing fiction much later than I did. Um, and it's been really fun to kind of watch her get the bug and then to see her both in the early stages of her career much older. And so on one hand, she's kind of more experienced about life and is a little calmer than I think people in their 20s who are starting to write. But on the other hand, she's just this kind of new and nervous and flummoxed by the literary urge and by the kind of business of getting published, which are two big, enormous things that are invisible to most people.
I love it. So we're waiting for the Rebecca Handler, Daniel Handler team up coming up,
I
eventually.
don't think we'll team up on a novel, but we've done some events together. I mean, we get along really, really well, and we've done some events together and things like that. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some official collaborative bonkers creative thing. But I don't think there are a lot of good books that are written by two people. And I don't, I've collaborated, of course, with a lot of illustrators and visual artists, but I can't really imagine ever collaborating with another writer per se.
Yeah, fair enough. And if anything, it would just, it would ruin your whole cafe writing vibe.
Yeah, well, I have people who write with me in cafes, and sometimes I will let that phrase slip. I'll say, write with me as if we're collaborating. We're not collaborating. It is like very deeply parallel play. And it's in fact funny sometimes that, for many days in a row and many weeks in a row, I will be with a couple of these writer companions, and we will write, for 4 hours before we switch from each other. And we've hardly had a conversation. I mean, I think if something shocking has happened to us once, and we might have a little kind of small talk while we're setting up, but I'll go for weeks seeing someone just about every day and then not really having a clue about what's happening in their lives. So it's a curious thing.
I love it. So I'm super excited to dig into that a little bit later, but I want to get back to your sort of education. You ended up going to Connecticut,
Yeah.
to Wesleyan, to study. And I'm curious about, like, you used the reference, like, the bug, getting the bug for writing. Like, when did, like, that transition from, like, I want to consume everything to, like, I want to start constructing narratives of my own really, really jump into your bones?
Oh, at a very, very young age. I mean, I wanted to be a writer pretty much, I think, as soon as I could write. I was writing little things and stapling them together and telling people I was a writer. And, once I hit adolescence, I wrote a mountain of poetry and a handful of short stories. And I tried writing a novel at the end of high school. So college was, I learned a great deal and I got to kind of spelunk around as a reader in literature. Um, and then I had a really great mentor, Kit Reed, who she kind of took the bug and she made it into work in a way that was still exciting. And I learned so much from her, not only kind of about craft and process, but also she was a beloved teacher and she was defiantly unsnobby. And so many, many other people who were writers came back to visit her, or she would invite writers that she knew over, and everybody would have dinner at her house. And I got to be a part of that. So I just met a lot of writers early on. I learned. I just sat and listened to them tell stories of getting ideas and researching books and publishing and, working on something and it's a mess and kind of all that frustration was out in the open. And because she was so open to all different kinds of writing, to really learn that that was all made of the same stuff, that someone who was writing their 18th genre novel about zombies and someone who was writing their kind of arty prose poem about traveling to a remote location. There were film and TV writers who were there, some fairly visible and some utterly unknown. And they were all part of the conversation. They were all doing that. And I think that that was something that I got. I'm so grateful that I got that early because all the kind of pretensions and fantasies that you have when you're a young writer are so powerful. And this was a kind of constant reminder of if you're not sitting down and putting things on paper, that's what writing is. It's not about having an attitude and being kind of cool. Um, and I think it also, when an opportunity was presented to me to write for children, I didn't have um, nearly as much resistant to that as I think many writers would who thought, I'm going to be Vladimir Nabokov, so why are you asking me to be Judy Blume? But instead, to kind of be in a space where Judy Blume and Vladimir Nabokov were doing the same thing was a really great way to go. So I got the bug early, but I kind of I got settled in it in college. So I learned a lot of skill, but I also just learned like the kind of ethic and the work of it.
Yeah, and I had the privilege of seeing you speak a few months ago, and you talked about Kit Reed and her sort of like welcoming you into independent meetings and saying like, "Oh, that's what you're interested in. Like, here's kind of a reading list you should follow and whatnot." And then like being able to use that as like a jumping off point to like find more inspiration. Like, was that was that the type of dynamic you had, or am I conflating stories?
Yeah, I mean, it was that, but I mean, inspiration again is like a little too heady a word for what it was. It was more like stealing, it was more like, how do you get something done that's in so much dialogue and move it forward, or like, who's good at description of the outdoors that doesn't make you yawn? And then also to hear so many writers say, oh, I read this thing and I got super excited about it, and then I went and made a thing and to be able to see work that didn't really superficially resemble itself, different kinds of work, and then but to know that it came out of that kind of study and that kind of imitation, that was really powerful. So I don't really teach, but when I go and talk or I'll teach for a few days in place, um, I try to teach about trying to solidify inspiration into something that's actually helpful. Because inspiration's easy to just be like, I'm going to read something that I love. And you're like, hot damn, that was good. And then you go back to your desk and your own stuff is totally miserable. And you think, oh, I'm never going to be as good as the stuff that I like. But to kind of dive in and figure out what makes stuff tick is good. And now among the writers that I'm close to, when we talk about work, it has that feel. Well, they'll just say, I really want to, how do I do something where I mean, I have a friend right now who's writing something, and part of it is from the point of view of an animal. And she said, I just can't find anything from the point of view of an animal that's really good. And we were kind of racking our brains, and we like emailed a few other people, and we had to kind of develop this list of things that are a little bit from the point of view of an animal, or have such a strong point of view that you might think about how you can do that with an animal. And that kind of problem solving, that kind of tapping in to the vast trove of literature that's awaiting you, I think is a really important skill. So that when you're alone, when you feel alone in something, when you just think, I just don't know how to make this thing that I want to do, that to think, oh yeah, there's so much example of that on paper. Like I can just go and find that. And I think that was a big part of the skill set that Kit bequeathed me in college.
And it also sounds like there was an inherent filtration system where like the people that are invited to the table are the people who are actually putting a pen to paper. As you talked about, just like inspiration being something that's easy, and it's so easy to sit there and say like, "Oh, I'm going to write a book," or "I'm writing a book," but not actually put anything down. And all of a sudden being invited to these meetings in these places where like people are making stuff and they're like sharing some of it, in like these I don't know, like infanty forms.
Yeah, I mean, it felt like everyone was invited. I think the only people who were not invited to the table were people who were not nice. And so, and I think that was a really good lesson too. I know lots of people who were taught young in their writing lives to kind of genuflect towards writers who were a really big deal and who were not nice. And I don't think that gets you anything. I mean, you can read work of people who turn out to be nice, not nice. I think that's fine. But I think the idea of oh, this instructor is shouting at us all the time, or, they're really sexist or something. But they've won the National Book Critics Circle Award or something, so we better be nice to them, has never made any sense to me. And so that was part of it too, was to hear writers kind of roll their eyes at insufferable writers.
Well, thanks for being nice, Daniel. I appreciate your kindness.
Thank you. One tries.
So you make it through that whole college thing, and I actually don't know when this starts, but like you start writing a book called The Basic Eight, which ends up being your first published novel, if I understand. And I'm curious
Yeah.
about like what how does that book start to get legs? And I guess what I'm saying is like you've been writing for a long time, and you're gaining this confidence. Like how does that become the project that you decide you really want to send out and sell? Because like for listeners who aren't familiar with this, I've read that it got rejected like 37 times before somebody published it, so like
Yeah, I got a ton of rejection. And it was really my second novel. It was my first published novel, but I wrote a novel before that. Um, and before that, I wrote a kind of novella that was a big project that I did with Kit that she really, really helped me with. Um, and when that was over, I thought I knew it was over, but it's not something I would ever publish. And even then, I thought, I know I finished and hooray for me, but it's not that good. Um, and uh, and then I wrote a whole other novel, a bunch of drafts, worked on it really hard with Kit. This was right after I graduated from college. Um, and I tried to get an agent with it, and it wasn't good, and I didn't get accepted. And it was one of those things where I would get letters of rejection, and I would think, "Yep, you called it. This is not what you want." And and then, I just had another idea. I had this idea for the basic eight, and it just kind of, dangled it in front of me like a plum. And it was something that I really wanted to do. And the format of the novel is a diary. And that was kind of the beginning of me really having fun with form with fiction. And that really helped me through a bunch of my career. I'm a little less, it's less mandatory now form than it was for a long time. But I think that when you decide that a book is in the form of something, you have something to do every day. You know what the next thing is, and you don't have to kind of court the muse. And so the basic it was a diary. So it's just like it's a diary of a girl in high school, and she's rewriting the diary for the purposes of publication. And so it kind of switches levels of innocence and corruption. But it also just meant like here we are on Friday, so you better think about what happens on Friday and continue the plot through that filter. And I think that really helped too. It really helped me kind of sit down every day and think about what would happen next.
amazing. And like clearly you spend a good amount of time getting that published. A series of unfortunate events ends up publishing around the same time, if I
Yeah.
understand. Like I'm assuming you had finished that book and then started doing a series of unfortunate events, or was that like something kind of came kind of
No,
quick?
I finished that book. It was taking a long time to sell. I started working on what became my second published novel, a novel called Watch Your Mouth. And my agent managed to sell the Basic Eight and Watch Your Mouth after a number of years. She sold them both for $10,000. Um, and I was living in New York at the time. I didn't have another job. I had had jobs before and kind of saved my money. And um, it was a real moment for me because it was a moment of triumph and also a moment of terror. I thought it's one thing to be broke and not really have your life together when you're pursuing a dream. If your dream has come true and you're broke and your life is not hanging together, it's time to switch strategies a little bit. And so um, I I basically was pursuing kind of other writing opportunities. And the Basic Eight had taken a long time to publish because it's set in high school. My agent had sent it kind of as a last ditch effort to some editors of books for young people. Young adult fiction was not really happening then. And so the idea of a novel set in high school was unusual and not appealing. So adult publishers were basically like, who the hell wants to read about high school? And children's publishers were like, we don't do stuff about high school. And if we did, when we rarely, rarely do it, we certainly don't do it about high school students who are drinking and having sex and taking drugs and then murdering each other, which is what happens in the Basic Eight. Um, It's funny now because now I don't think you could publish a novel that was set in high school that didn't have any of that in it. Um, and and those editors had said, here's we can't publish the basic eight. There's drugs and sex, and it's long, and it's not really for it's not for a 13-year-old. It might be for an 18-year-old. Um, and I began to think about something that I could write for young people because these editors had kind of responded to my work. Um, and between my before the basic eight and then again after the basic eight, I had kind of toyed with this idea of a modern Gothic novel. I thought it would be fun to try to write that. And it didn't go well, kind of either attempt at it. And the kind of central conceit, I decided to gender swap it. So a typical Gothic novel is about a young woman who's in trouble. She's taken someplace isolated, to a big mansion, and horrible things are happening, and she has no way to escape. And I thought, I'm going to take this, be a young man, and put it these places. I was trying to have it take place in the present day or a kind of ambiguous present. And I just kept thinking, why doesn't he just leave? You know? It's kind of like all the poorly made horror films where they say like, "Oh my goodness, the police station is not here and all our phones don't work." That desperate thing that keeps you in the haunted place. And I couldn't figure it out. And when I started to think about writing for young people, I thought, "Oh, if the hero of this Gothic novel was a child, then the problem of why don't they leave has been completely fixed." And then I began to think, well, if there's more than one child, then they can talk to each other and say, oh, what a terrible predicament we're in. And that was the beginning of a series of unfortunate events. And so, yeah, I think if the Basic Eight had sold for $10 million, I don't know if I would have looked back on an opportunity to do something that has brought me so much joy and solace.
I love it. So, the editor you talked about, was it Susan Rich was the one that had
Mhm.
kind of encouraged you?
Yeah.
What was it about your writing at the time that she felt kind of could better communicate to children?
I just think she read the Basic Eight and she liked it. And then also she had her master's in children's literature, children's publishing, from Simmons, which is the school in Boston that is known for that. And so she really liked to kind of think about children's literature and the way in which children's literature works. And that was really interesting to me. I think basically from my time with Kit Reed, where I thought I'm more than happy to talk about children's literature. I don't think it's beneath me. And um, and at the time, I think it's less so now, but so many people in children's literature were people who couldn't get jobs in adult literature. They just ended up in that part of publishing. And so they weren't particularly attached to it, and they didn't really like to think about it. And I think you see that in a lot of children's publishing, where they say, like, oh, we can't really publish anything that's super exciting, so we'll just do this kind of cookie cutter stuff. And she wasn't like that. She was very interested in thinking about where other stuff could come from. And she saw being in New York, where so many young writers were, as an opportunity to kind of try to beckon young writers and young visual artists into the world of children's books.
So, I don't want to dig into this too much, but I am curious. Like, Series of Unfortunate Events is a 13-book series
Yeah,
that you wrote or let me rephrase, was published between 99 and 2006.
yeah.
But right from the beginning, had you planned it as being so?
I mean, I said 13 books would be a hilarious number of these books to do. And the publisher said, well, let's see how we do this. Um, and my first contract was for 4 volumes. And I remember that I said to my agent, who is still my agent, um, I can't believe they're going to let me write 4 books. I mean, I had written, 2 things that I thought weren't good, an abandoned Gothic novel, and then 2 novels that I finally managed to sell after I wrote them. Now I had a contract to write 4 novels that I hadn't written yet. And that just seemed like a crazy thing to have happened. And my agent said, they're never going to publish 4 of these. You don't have to worry about it. Um, and they did. And because early on, they weren't some kind of enormous hit early on, but they did well enough, and I think I seemed perhaps deceptively like a sane enough and competent enough writer to keep going. And so when they said, "Oh, this person will turn it in on a deadline and it'll be a real book," it isn't something that we have to pursue. Um, if he's up to do more, let's just sign him up.
Well, you do self-identify as a lunatic in your new memoir. So, you know,
Yeah.
I, and I'm okay. So I'm curious about this relationship between structure and children's books because I think that, like, as a structuralist, I mean, one of the things that I even see you do is like think about the structure of the marketing ads on the back of the book, like for all of your books. Like, it's really fun to just like if you want a Daniel Handler writing experience, you just read what's on the back of a book, and you're like, that's a really funky structural way to think about writing. Like on the back of All the Wrong Questions, you literally have a survey for people to fill out. Like, that's
Yeah.
hysterical. And just I reread the first the Bad Beginning, the first series of unfortunate events book over the last few days, and the every time you have the sort of writing device of you say a term or you say a phrase or you say a word, and then you say what this word means is, and it becomes this teaching moment for a reader, a young reader, but it also becomes like a fun kind of like joke that you're in on. It's just like a fun thing. Like the example I have written down here is like you say casing the joint, and you're like, in the crime industry, casing the joint means this. And I'm curious about like that relationship with structure and how I guess that was like massaged to become something that worked so well in your children's writing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of vocabulary, I think a lot of it was at the beginning was just a little self-consciousness of, I want to use the phrase casing the joint, and I don't, and I'm writing for people who might not know what that term means. When you're writing an adult novel and you want to use the phrase casing the joint, you just usually dive in. You don't have the urge to explain it. And I don't, so often children are taught vocabulary in a way that is not appealing. And, that is, we're going to give you a list of words that you ought to be using, but you won't use, that you'll memorize, and then you'll take a test on them, and that will be the end of your using that word. And then meanwhile, of course, children are gathering more and more language from wandering out in the world. And if something is fun to say, or a more exact way to say it, or whatever it is, and then they use it. And so I mean, casing the joint, for instance, was something that my family used to say when I was young. They would say, like, oh, here's the restaurant that we're going to go to on Friday. We're walking by. Let's case the joint. Let's just see, let's look at the menu and like where we might sit or something like that. And, um, now I see that that was my parents with two young children, trying to kill time and distract us from the ice cream store that we weren't going to go place the joint or whatever it was. But the notion of like, oh, that's a fun way to say a thing that is normal to do. To me, that's the heart of language and vocabulary. Right. There's lots of boring ways to say something. You don't need fancy words if you don't like them, but they're fun. And so, and then also that vocabulary is so often specific to the occasion. And so casing the joint is something that is used by criminals, but I didn't use it. That wasn't what my parents were doing. And when I had the Baudelaire's case the joint, then they're not being criminals either. And so yeah, I think all that is fun. But yeah, I guess I mean I don't I don't want to descend into dreary semantics, but when I think of something like casing the joint, I don't think of that as structure. For me, structure is that um, a series of unfortunate events. All the books until the last one have 13 chapters, and so that was just a thing to think about of like, what's the end of a third chapter look like when you have 13 chapters? Where are we going with this? And I think that was what was fun, was to start to kind of make outlines and be like, well, I know how many Roman numerals are in this outline. There are 13. And that's what I think of when I think of structure. I think of kind of the big macro gambit of literature rather than these other kind of rhetorical ticks. But that's just how I think of structure.
I really appreciate you specifying the difference there because we all think about especially I know you hate the word process, but like through that process, like the way in which structure versus a literary mechanic versus just like something I did unintentionally that just happened to pay out at the end, like all those things kind of come together. One of the things that's really important, and I know listeners who are tuning in. They might not know that Daniel Handler wrote a series of unfortunate events because some weirdo named Lemony Snicket is on the book title.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if we can dig into the origin story a little bit of Lemony Snicket.
Um, well, there was many things came together, I guess, but one of them was that when I was researching the Basic Eight, I had an office job in San Francisco, and I say researching, but I mean I didn't know. I didn't have a plan on how to research things. It was just more like I need some more stuff that I want to be moving around on kind of the desktop of my mind that's going into a book. And part of the plot of the Basic Eight is that this one girl in high school kills a boy in high school, and then the media and other commentators kind of take that story and run with it for their own causes. And I was like, okay, well, if you were like a conservative person, politically conservative, what would you make of a murder story like this? And so I would watch some kind of crummy TV that normally wouldn't appeal to me. There was like round table discussions of people talking about things and just thinking, oh, well, that person's an idiot. Like, what? Let's keep on listening to them, see what they would say. And I would just write down phrases that they said and other things like that. And from my office job, I started to call right-wing organizations and request their materials because they'd send me some big colorful pamphlet about, the problem of why we can't pray in school and why that's ruining everything. And then I would be able to take these really horrible, dorky phrases that they would use and just put them right in my conservative commentary on the novel. And I was on the phone with one organization and I said, so will you mail me your material? And they said, yes, of course. What is your name? And I thought in that moment, don't say your name. You don't give them your name. Just say something else. And so I said something else. And what I said was Lemony Snicket. And then there was a pause. And during the pause, I thought, all you had to say was something that wasn't your name. Like that's a very easy assignment. And what you said was instead this ridiculous phrase. It isn't anything. And I thought she's going to hang up on me because no one's that stupid to think that's a name. And then the woman from the right-wing organization said, is that spelled how it sounds? And I said, yes. And then I said, read it back to me because I had no idea how it sounded like it was spelled. It didn't sound like anything. And then this became a name that I used not only for that, but I would just use when it was you go to a sandwich place and you order your sandwich and they ask for your name. Um, I had a kind of prank hobby at my office job where these tiny neighborhood newspapers were delivered to my office for obscure reasons, and I would write furious letters to the editor at the office on the typewriter, and I would sign them Lemony Snicket. And it was just a name that I used all the time. My friends gave me some business cards that had said Lemony Snicket, and I used to kind of hand them out at bars and vaguely pretend I was a person. And then when I started years later writing a series of unfortunate events, when there was a narrator who was part of the structure, shall we say, was that the story is being told by someone who's not involved in the story, but he's a first person and he's talking to the reader, but he's not able to control what's going on in the story. He's not part of it. And you have the sense that it's years later that he's kind of retracing the steps. And that seemed interesting and lonely and gothic to me. And then I had a name lying around for an unreliable narrator who was not involved in his own story. And and then I just basically thought it would be more interesting to publish the books under the name of the narrator. I just thought that would be more fun for young people to think, oh, there's this mysterious person who's writing them. Who is this person? Instead of, hi, kids, it's me. I'm trying to make a living. because that didn't seem like a fun thing to convey to a reader. And there were so many books that I liked when I was young that had that air of mystery about them. And I mean, one of the big ones was Edward Gorey, who had a strange name. He also wrote books under different names, but everyone knew it was Edward Gorey. And he wrote these books that referred to works of art and cities and royalty, and they were all, he acted like we knew them too, but they weren't, he made them all up. And when I was a child, that was one kind of mystery for me was, what is this? And as I grew older and I understood that he made them all up, there was still this mystery of like, what a fun thing. How do you make that space in which you're really participating in this thing, even though you know on some level that it is nonsense? And so publishing the books under the name of the narrator, it was just something that felt like it was key to that story. It just felt fun to me.
That's awesome. And I guess that's one thing I was curious about because, we talk about structure again, but like the back of the book is a letter from Lemony Snicket, like telling you,
Yeah.
like part of the plot, but also like warning you that like this is going to be an unpleasant experience. And it's just interesting to think about kids picking that up, hearing, this sort of like fictionalized name, not really being sure whether this is being written by a real person or by, like some sort of magical ether. Like it's I mean, obviously it's been successful, but I just think that it's fascinating that like maybe, deep down, Lemony Snicket might really just be a weird right-wing person that we are unaware of.
Hopefully not right wing, but I think the that kind of permanent smile of so much children's culture is just really irritating. And the pretense that everyone is shouting and happy, and that's what's most attractive to young people is really horrendous. And the publisher said, let's put something on the backs of these books that like will make people think it's exciting. Why don't you take a crack at writing some cover copy that'll make people want to read the book? And I just thought, ugh, who even wants to read these books? It's just miserable. And I couldn't do it. I took some lousy crack at it. I couldn't figure out what it was. And then I went out and I ran some errands and I went to the pharmacy and I saw like the warning on something. I was like, oh, I like this. Um, the idea that something was like not for you was so much more appealing. And I remember early on I would go to kind of libraries and bookstores, and we would often there'd be three or four authors that they'd schlep someplace and we're all trying to kind of hawk our wares. And I remember that I would just say, no one should be touching these books. I would take them out of kids' hands. In the library was always fun because I would just say like, let's leave this whole section. Let's go over here. And I would take them to some adult section of like deep intellect, and I would just say, critique of pure reason. If you read this when you're 10, you're gonna love it. Like, look at this 800-page philosophical treatise with a weird geometrical design on the cover and no illustrations whatsoever. This is what you want. And that was way more fun to me. And it felt less transparently needy and weird than all the authors who were saying, like, hey, do you like outer space? I have an outer space book for you. And I would say, outer space? Who wants to read about outer space? You're not going to breathe. You can't breathe in outer space. That's a horrible story. And um, and that's still, I mean, it's still how I enjoy talking to young people, and it's still how I enjoy talking to kind of middle-aged people. I think that this kind of constant cheer and letting someone in is really exhausting. Um, yeah.
Cool. So one of the I want to go to the library with you right now and see what section you throw me into. I think is the next challenge. Next time I'm in San Francisco and we've just swam in the
Great.
bay.
We'll go library hopping. Yeah.
Love it. So, one of the other things I'm curious about, obviously, you've talked ad nauseum about a series of unfortunate events, and I want to make sure we talk about other stuff you've done. But you right from the beginning collaborate with Brett J. Helquist, if I
Mhm.
understand correctly.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I find fascinating as somebody who like, in my own research, my own interest, like the comic book medium is like a super collaborative medium. Um, and in children's literature, it's unique in the sense that like oftentimes people will write a book and then it gets shipped off to some other illustrator to basically put in like uh, I don't know, little breathing space illustrations, and then
Mhm.
you get the book back and you're like, this is not what I expected at all. But those illustrations are so important for the world building of an 8-year-old who's reading those books. And I'm curious about like going, I'm sorry, we're going way back to, 99 or whatever, but like, what was it like partnering with Brett, and then seeing those interpretations of the Baudelaire Orphans like come out?
Well, in some ways, it was exactly that traditional collaboration that you laid out. Um, I just, for the 25th anniversary of a series of unfortunate events, I just worked on a tiny little thing that we're adding that Brett is illustrating. And it was the first time I talked to Brett in years. And and we kept a pretty solid distance from each other. He's a quiet person, so I don't think we had an immediate platonic camaraderie, but we liked each other's work a lot. And he was doing such a splendid job, and then it began to be like, oh, we hardly ever speak. Let's not tip this over. Let's keep this going. We can make other friends, but we maybe can't do this again. And um, and I think that he had the same benefit that I did in that he was young and he hadn't really done it before. He had illustrated things before, but he hadn't illustrated a children's book. And so neither of us had a sense um of the kind of so-called rules of what it is. Nobody said, "Oh, they have to be children and they have to be like this and it has to be like this." And he Yeah, he immediately had this kind of pencily style that looked like it was scrawled in the corner of a notebook or something, even though it is in fact painstakingly worked on. Um, but yeah, he just did this kind of beautiful thing right away that I really, really liked. And I'm not a big visual person, and so it wasn't that I had some picture in my head that I felt it had to convey. And I'm married to an illustrator. And so my wife's career was starting out when my career was starting out. And she did a lot of illustrations for magazines and um, other kind of menus and other things like that. And I saw her kind of worked to the bone by clients who didn't have a strong visual sense either, but would say, no, I don't want the rose up there. Put the rose over here. And then she'd put it over there. No, I want it over there. And so I saw how exhausting that was for an illustrator, how it didn't really bring them their best work, and how, collaboration really is giving something to somebody else and letting them do something with it. It's not delegation. And so right away, he started to make things which were enchanting. And part of the deal was that we didn't really communicate very much. And so that just felt like the right way. And then I've done other illustrator collaborations where we work very closely to each other. But I also always just try to be aware of, only give as much critique to that person as they're giving to you. And if they take the manuscript and they read it and they have a couple of questions, then you don't get to have 36,000 questions and comments about what they're doing. And I think collaboration is tricky because, I think it's particularly tricky in mediums where people are used to working by themselves. I think it's easier for musicians. If you're a drummer, you're not like, well, I've made 18 albums that are just drums and it's exactly the way I want. And now maybe I'm ready to play in a band. Like that's not how that goes. And so, um, but I write alone all day long and I try to make the sentences exactly the way I want them. And so when it's time to collaborate with someone else, I have to be aware that I'm really shifting gears in that way.
Interesting. Like just looking at the artwork for your other books too, like especially like All the Wrong Questions, like the styles are so specific and so driven and just impactful and powerful. Like they really do complement. So I wasn't sure whether or not there was dialogue there or if like you just keep hitting the lottery with these illustrators.
Yeah, I mean, good illustrators will do good work. I just think it's like I don't know what, there's some actors who are so good that it doesn't matter what movie they're in. They're going to do a really good job. Seth, who illustrated All the Wrong Questions, was my first choice. Um,
An excellent cartoonist.
yeah, a graphic novelist I'd always loved, and I loved that his graphic novels, um, take they have this lonely kind of solitary, not at all plot-driven tone to them, which makes them so beautiful. And then as I was starting to work on All the Wrong Questions, he did a cover for Poetry Magazine of a lonely town. And it looked exactly like the lonely town that I was kind of building and exploring as I was doing All the Wrong Questions. And so he came to a comic convention here in San Francisco, and I went. I, I remember it was called WonderCon, and people said it's not like Comic-Con, it's kind of a classier one. And so I thought, oh, well, maybe no wonder Seth's here, first of all, and then maybe there'll be so many wonderful artistic people that I won't even get to meet him. And I walked in, and I remember there was like an army of stormtroopers running past, and I thought, I think I'm going to be able to find this guy. And so I pushed my way through, all the movie promotion, and I found him, and he was sitting very neglected, wearing a suit, signing copies for no one. And I introduced myself and I said, hi, I would really love to work with you. And I gave him my email address, and then, I pitched him to the publisher. I was like, look at this kind of startling thing that he can do. And we had some, it was definitely not as immediately a smooth road, but a lot of that was my fault because I thought, oh, this is my new series and I'm a big deal now, and so I should get to do this thing. And I just remember thinking, oh, I'm not, I can tell I'm being a tough client at the beginning. And so I just started to say, like, why don't you draw something? Why don't we do it like this? And then he started, and then his work immediately blossomed for that.
All right, so the secret to a good collaboration with Daniel Handler is knowing the amount of space that you need.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's probably the secret to any collaboration. I feel better at collaboration now, but it's really tough. I think particularly if you're used to solitary activities.
Well, let's talk about some solitary activity, shall we? You love to go. Before this interview, you kindly showed me the type of legal pad that you use.
Mhm.
And for listeners at home, you can't see it. I'm sorry, but it's got good structure because everything is good structure for Daniel Handler. But you go to cafes and you just straight up write, which is impressive because my attention deficit disorder would prevent me from doing that. And I'm curious about like when that started becoming your process. Like, is that something that you've always done, or did you start with more of a seclusive approach and then kind of make your way to this kind of pseudo social writing?
I wrote at home basically until I had a baby. Um, and
And sorry, that was 2003, like around there.
yes, yeah. And as soon as the baby was born, the house had a different vibe because there was a baby in it, and the baby was really distracting. I wanted to look at the baby all the time and play with the baby, and we had someone who was helping us take care of the baby. My wife had illustration deadlines to do. I had book deadlines to do, and so I just started going to a cafe, and I would bring my laptop and everything. And then after no time at all, I was like, I don't like bringing my laptop to a cafe. And this was kind of when the laptop, I mean, now the laptop, there's lots of reasons I think not to bring your laptop to a cafe. This was not before the internet, but it was kind of before the internet was everywhere. And it was before your laptop was also your newspaper and your television and your telephone and your menu and everything else. But it was still, there was a lot of distraction. And then also the main thing was that I would then need to use the bathroom. And I thought, you either ask a stranger next to you to watch your laptop. You're like, I'm worried a stranger will have my laptop. So I'm going to ask this stranger to watch my laptop for me. Or you bring it into the bathroom and everyone's looking at you, wondering why you're bringing your laptop into the bathroom. And when you get to the bathroom, there's not a handy, clean, safe laptop shelf. And so I remember it was just 2 or 3 days that I worked in a cafe, and I thought, this isn't working. And then I thought, what if I just write down things on a piece of paper? No one's going to steal paper when you get up and use the bathroom. And that's in fact what I started to do. And I had written on paper for a while in college, and so I was so happy to be back to it, and it just felt super magical to me that um, you could write a paragraph, and then if it wasn't going well, instead of deleting it and messing with it, you could just start over, and you could take the stuff that you liked and put it down there. If you cross out a word, you can see it there. So maybe you think, oh, maybe that wasn't so terrible after all. Let me go back and find that. And all that. And then, of course, there's nothing coming in saying you have an email. Um, and yeah, I liked how separate it was from the hustle bustle of business. And now you couldn't pay me to take my laptop to a cafe. And so, yeah, I pack up a legal pad and I have notes on index cards, and I often bring something to listen to music with. Um, it, but I just began, I loved how portable it was, and I loved kind of the reminder that you can really write on anything. And so I like a legal pad, but my legal pad runs out or whatever, I'll write on kind of whatever is available. And I think that's it's just feels powerful to me. But people have been writing for a long time. You know, lots and lots of things have been written in prison and in monasteries and all kinds of places without any convenience attached to writing. And just to think, oh, you don't need all your stuff to write. And I've tried to seduce kind of more writer friends into it because they say, "Oh, I have a new thing now where you won't let you on the internet for a certain period of time unless you really need the internet." And then you go in and you do it. And I just think like you are you're like drinking alcohol all day long and then drinking coffee to make sure that you don't get too tired. It's like, how about none of that? Just how about just writing? And yeah, I just love the way that's shaped. And so yeah, I like to zip up my little pack and write, but I will even bring nothing but a legal pad and a pen if there's something I just want to get down, and I'll just walk. And just to walk with two objects in your hand and then walk into a cafe is pretty magic.
That's awesome. Couple rapid fire nuts and bolts questions about this.
Mhm.
Do you go to the same cafe or do you vary your cafes?
No, I vary my cafes. Every cafe has a tragic flaw. And also, I don't really, in the same way that I don't want to get attached to a laptop, I don't want to start thinking to myself, oh, there's only this, I got to write in this place. And I also don't, as with a bar, it's dangerous to become too friendly in a cafe. If you become a regular, then before you know it, they ask you what you're doing for a living, and then you tell them, and then they're like, oh, are you working on a new thing now? And then it's horrible. So, um, yeah, I have probably 10 cafes that I write in, and every cafe has a tragic flaw. And so once you have 10, you think like, okay, am I ready for the one where the bathroom is so terrible?
All right, cool. Question number two is, when you're searching for cafes, what menu items do you want to see there?
I don't want any delicious food. It's basically strong coffee. I drink espresso, but anywhere they're serving espresso, they'll have 10 other drinks. Um, And it's usually good if there's some food if you just get so hungry, but it's not time to leave. But I like it when the food is kind of crappy. Like if there's slices of banana bread that are all pre-wrapped in cellophane, I know I've reached that's a good place. Because particularly in California, there's just places that'll be like, we have seared tuna on a bed of arugula. And then you'll think, well, that's protein. I'll have that. And then you think, oh my God, I've had a delicious meal and I'm in like a calorie coma and everything is delicious. And before you know it, you think, why don't I just have a glass of rosé? And then well, it's all done. And so, yeah, so kind of crappy food.
That's really funny. I feel like I'm beaming into you right now from Syracuse, New York, and I can't think of a single, and I love my cafes here, but I can't think of a single one that reaches that level of good food that would prevent Dan Handler from writing there. So I guess we're doing something right.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, it's tougher in San Francisco. They want to, they're like, there's a place that I go to sometimes, and it has a duck fat pound cake. And when you have a slice of duck fat pound cake, you can't eat anything or think about anything for 12 hours. So I try not to go there.
All right, and question three related to the cafes is you alluded earlier to bringing other people into, your little like writing. It's not even writing circle. It's like writing silent sit down. How did that sort of collaborative support process to get other writers to join you start up?
I had a writer friend who was having a lot of trouble. Um, he couldn't get a book done, and he just felt like he couldn't work. And I started to say, "Why don't you come with me?" And I said, like, "I'm not going to talk to you, so just come with me." And then he would. And I mean, you mentioned that that isn't what you think you could do. Um, but there's something about having other people around you that kind of keeps you honest. You just can't kick back and do nothing. Um, and so I like that. Um, every so often I'll need to kind of take a walk around the block to clear my head. And I remember, and I'll just stand up from the table. This has happened so many times that I remember that, and the person I'll be writing with will kind of look at me like, I know you're not quitting. Like it's only been an hour. What's up with you? And that, if I were alone, I'd be like, maybe I am quitting. I'm self-employed. I can go eat dumplings if I want to, But it's kind of nice to have someone just a little, they're not scolding me, but they're like, what's going on there? And then I'm like, oh, I'm just going around the block. And then I go around the block and then I think it's time to sit back down. So
I think they call it body doubling, right?
yeah, I guess so. I mean, and I'm trying to think it's not a very long list of writers that I do it with. But uh and it's a kind of a self-selecting group. It's not like I think who can I bequeath this wonderful ask to? It's more that a lot of writers are saying, "Oh, I could never do that in a million years."
Well, it's not like you're creating a meetup.com and then saying, come and avoid the, pan-seared tuna with me at, this
Yeah,
place.
yeah. And and actually, once a long time ago, someone asked me kind of if I would do one night of writing where everybody would write in the same room. And so I was like, okay, we'll try it. And it didn't work. But um, but I remember that there were people who showed up who thought it was going to be like some hip thing. Not necessarily because of me, but just because of like, oh, it's going to be like a scene where like writers are going to be hanging out. And I made me miss Kit Reed a lot. So I thought like, yeah, we're not hanging out. We're not drinking absinthe and, talking about the best editors at Knopf. We're working.
Well, speaking of working, I want to, you have a very varied history in the screenwriting world. Rumor is there was a movie that came out in 2004 about a book that you had written that you may or may not have written seven or eight versions of the screenplay on, and then kind of left that behind you. And then a certain TV show from Netflix called A Series of Unfortunate Events
Hear
started to
that?
come together that you may or may not have run the writer's room on. Um, and I was curious about like, that going from that writing process of, I'm gonna just sit in a cafe and I'm gonna write on a legal pad and I'm gonna function this way to bringing other people in and we're all gonna sit quietly and write to I'm gonna now be in a room with a bunch of people where I'm gonna help direct writers and encourage writers and grow writers and get the best product out of them that I can. I'm curious about like how you responded to that project initially and what kind of you learned from that process.
Well, I think the big difference between writing for screen and writing for publishing is that movies and TV are really, really expensive. And so the choices that you make are much more attached to the business than they are of anything else. there's some content that if you put in a book will become more popular or less popular, arguably, though Lord knows you can, walk a bookstore and see a million failed spy thrillers, um, and then a million books with weird things that never should work that are huge hits. And so, but the nuts and bolts of publishing, if you say, I'm changing the end of my book, they all go to Sweden. Um, the publisher isn't like, well, that's like airfare and hotels for everyone because it's a book. And if you say that in the movie, if you say like, we're gonna, the finale's got to be at Easter Island, we got to film it at Easter Island, then that's a huge business attached to it. And so the people in charge of the business are looking at the content all the time and are concerned about it and are asking questions about it. Um, I think that's the big difference. And so it's really exhausting. And it means that you have to play that game. You can't really not be interested in the business when you're working in film or television. You have to engage with it. And I don't find it inherently interesting. I'm not a competitive person. I don't think I'm a particularly manipulative person. And I just don't want to be in a room and go pitch something and get somebody excited and use that excitement to get them to agree to my thing. I find all that exhausting. And so I'm not born for that business. Um, but I also don't, I think for the writing part, I don't think I'm bad at it. And so it's true, I wrote a bunch of screenplays for the Unfortunate Events movie, and I was eventually fired. Um, and it was hard to be fired for sure, and it was hard to write all those drafts, but I learned a lot too. I learned kind of about how story is structured and how you can do things concisely. Um, and then for the TV show, they had a writer's room at first. They had a whole other writer's room, and it didn't work. They made really bad scripts. And so um, they said they had me fix all these scripts, which was exhausting. And then they said, you want to come back for another season? And I was like, no, you guys don't, no. And they said, like, how could you do it where you do it? And I said, well, I would choose the writers and we would meet in San Francisco in my house. And they said, okay, sure. And then then I had to do it. And I didn't know who I didn't know who I would choose. And so there was one writer, Joe Trace, who was when he was first hired, I think as kind of like we better have a young guy who isn't that experienced in TV writing, just because then we can say that we did. And he was by far the strongest writer in the original writer's room. And so he came aboard, and I used his network and some other networks of people, and I basically found it turned out to be the kind of queer playwright network. Not particularly by design, but that's how it turned out. And they were really great. They were new to writing for TV, but they weren't new to writing a script over and over again and fixing things. And so they were well suited to it. And because they were new, we couldn't get the first writers room to read the books, which was frustrating. And these guys all read the books in order to meet and interview to see if they could get the gig. And so we had a good room. And then another thing that happens in a writer's room typically is that it's competitive. Um, you'll have 20 people in the room writing a sitcom, and the people who get the best jokes they'll get credited for the whole episode, or they'll get to write the whole episode, and that's more money. So everyone's trying to do it. And again, some people thrive in that. It's like all the funniest TV that you've ever seen was written by a bunch of people topping each other with jokes. And that's great. Um, but I don't think it works for not comedy particularly because you can't top each other with pathos. And then and then it is also a reason why the the urge to diversify writers' rooms is often stopped at the process of writing. And so if you make a competitive thing where a bunch of people are trying to get theirs, you're going to attract a certain kind of person. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that it turns out to be like a bunch of white guys who've had a great education. And I'm a white guy who's had a great education. Some of my best friends are white guys who are out of great education, but it's not diversity. And so as soon as we had the writers' room, I said, we're not competing for credit. Here's how we're doing it. Everybody's going to get a certain amount of credit, and an episode is going to be credited to them. And so you're going to have, when the season is done, you're going to have this on your resume that you wrote an episode for this and you were paid accordingly. And and so then everyone relaxed. And then it was more like, okay, how can we all figure out what the scene is and who's going to take a crack at this part that's really going to do it? Or I've written myself into this wall and I don't know how to get out of it. And will someone help me? And asking for help is no longer seeing some money get taken out of my wallet. And I was proud of kind of working it that way. And it seemed like it worked well and it was really fun. I was also then fired twice. Well, I was fired the first time with the old room, and then I was fired that, and that was frustrating and hard again. But the collaboration was really fun, and it made me happy that I could shape something to my own ethic. And I haven't done any TV since. It's a tough time in TV now anyway. But I would sometime, and I've done some other stuff, theater stuff and music stuff, where I feel like what I learned about running a room was really helpful. That I learned how to make a space in which people could do their best work. And even though it was my thing, or even though I was in charge of it, that still everybody felt kind of comfortable and happy. And that was a really, so it was a wonderful experience, despite it also being a tough experience.
Well, I appreciate you being so upfront and honest about that. And I'm sorry about, tearing open wounds and being like, let's talk about your own series of unfortunate events. But I want to just applaud you and just like publicly about creating an equitable payment structure for this creative work. Because I think that a lot of people fail to understand that like some great work comes out of suffering. I mean, and other great work comes out of like having a comfortable foundation and being able to build from that. And when you're trying to tell effective stories and people are just worried that they're not going to be able to, pay next month's rent because their name isn't plastered on episode 4, like that prevents a lot of interesting creativity from happening. So like I just want to say like that's an amazing, dare I say, structural way to solve the problem in the writer's room.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly, I wouldn't want to go on record with anyone having the interpretation that I'm the only one who's doing this. There are many other people who are making those sort of strides, but we won a Writers Guild Award for the show, and we all got up to accept the award because we'd all been working together. And the assistant, we had one assistant who did a lot of kind of grunt work, and she gave the speech. And at the time, I just thought like that'll be a hoot. And then she gave the speech. The rest of us just stood there. But then the next day, she got her job for TV because somebody said, "Well, if they let you write the speech, you must be really good." And she is really good. It doesn't follow actually that she got to give the speech means that she was really good. But it was nice to know that people kind of had their eye on that. And I know, I don't think it was all granted, but a bunch of other people in TV started to say, can I have them meet at my house? Like, why are we renting an office that's super expensive and we're ordering takeout food in every day and we have, 8 people running around fetching things? And I just said, like, if we want to watch a scene from a movie to study how that might work, we all have laptops, let's call it up and let's watch it. And, I cooked for them lunch a bunch of times. We had cocktail hour every time at the end of the time. My kid would come home, my wife would come home. So they got a sense of like, he has a private life too. He's not going to demand that we all stay up all night doing this thing. And yeah, it's just a much better way of making art. It was more fun. It was way more fun.
Well, awesome. Well, you've been very generous with your time, and I got a few wrap up questions or a few sort of,
Okay.
if you don't mind. But you alluded to collaborations in music
Mhm.
earlier, and one of the things that I had actually heard about you. was that you're a phenomenal accordion player, my friend, and that have played people's weddings and you've done different promotional events. You've been recorded for the Magnetic Fields, on their record. The first one also in 1999, if I understand correctly.
Yeah.
But I was curious if you could tell us your origin story on your accordion playing.
Well, first of all, I'm not a phenomenal accordion player. I'm pretty mediocre. But the thing is that if you play the accordion, you're probably the best accordion player anybody knows. And so I went to college. I'd taken piano lessons my whole childhood and most of my adolescence. And I went to college and I wanted to be in a band. And it was the late 80s, which was a time in pop music history when no keyboard instruments were cool. It wasn't authentic, man, to have a synthesizer, which is I think quite hilarious. As if like a guitar, as if like strumming strings is somehow realer than like pressing a key. But I digress. And so I wanted to be in a band, so I bought an accordion because I thought, oh, here's something that I can kind of play, and no one else plays it. And believe it or not, was like kind of cooler than a synthesizer at the time. And so yeah, so I did a little bit of that. I was in various bands that were certainly not going anywhere, but hardly any of us were deluded to think that it was going someplace. We had a lot of fun. Um, and then when I moved to New York, I was already a fan of the songwriting of Stephen Merritt, and I had some fantasy that he and I would work on something together. And he'd had a few records then, but he wasn't he certainly wasn't very well known. And I managed to meet him. Kind of a friend of a friend wrote a thing about him once, and so I kind of tracked him down, and he learned that I played the accordion, and he was just about to make this. His second album is The Sixths, which is where he writes the songs, but other people sing them. And for the second Sixths record, which came out years later, it was the first record I worked on with him, but it wasn't the first one that came out. And he wanted to pair vocalists with one instrument, which is how most of that record is. And so he was like, "Oh, an accord, like perfect! Like I just met someone to play the accordion." And so it was like 3 days later that I was in a recording studio playing behind Odetta, this folk music icon who died a few years ago. Um, and that was my kind of crash course in starting to work with Stephen. And yeah, Mr. Merritt he's a phenomenal musician, and he has a peculiar and wondrous mind. And I do just think that when you're near people who are good at things, that can just be its own reward. And so I've been on a bunch of records with him since, and we've done all kinds of wacky shows together. And I love being near it and watching it work. And and then as a result of the magnetic fields, then I've gotten to play on kind of other people's records or other people who I know or kind of do it. And I have been a kind of hanger-on of that generation of pop musicians a little bit. Um, I'm working on two musical theater things now, both with pop musicians. And I think because I had a serious musical upbringing, I have a good thing for that. But also I'm not a very good musician. And so it's easy to collaborate in that way because I know it's not my thing at all. And so when I play accordion with the magnetic fields, I'm filling in this like one little piece in a color by number painting that someone else has made. Um, and that's an exciting way to go about it.
I watched a wonderful live wire radio video where a member of the Decemberists collaborated with you by holding your jacket.
Yes, Colin Malloy. He is in fact writing songs for the Snicket musical. So we're doing a more solid collaboration now than he was. But yeah, that was fun.
And just wrapping up on this real quick, how often do you practice your accordion?
Not very often, but it's kind of, I would say I have a gig for one reason or another every couple of months. Um, and I know some musicians who occasionally get together and we'll do that a little bit. But yeah, I like playing music. It's fun. And I like that it isn't my thing. And so then it's nice to kind of be in an art form where other people are doing the heavy lifting.
I think you're the lost member of the rock bottom remainders that they don't know they need.
Oh, well, I played with the Rock Bottom Remainders. But uh yeah, I mean they lasted longer than kind of their spotlight lasted, and they would play every year at the Miami Book Festival. So I played a few times with them. Um but then they lost some members, not their high profile writers, but kind of the real musical core. There was a super nice woman who died, and that kind of ended that band. But yeah, that was a band entirely made out of writers who didn't really know how to be a rock band but wanted to be.
Well, I have to say this. I didn't know that you had played with them. You're the second member who I've interviewed. I had Richard Christian Matheson on the show a few years ago, or a few months
Yeah.
ago, who was playing drums.
Yeah, if you could actually play something, you could get a better gig. Everybody wants to sing. Every writer is like, oh, I've always wanted to do these boots are made for walking. And it's like, okay, we'll do it. But if you could do something other than sing, you can hang out with them for a while.
I love it. Well, Daniel, again, you've been so generous with your time. I'm going to put you on the spot. Not that I haven't already, but now there's a big spotlight on you, and we're going to see if this works. But one of the things that I love about your approach to life is that you often carry poetry around with you,
Mhm.
whether it's in your pocket or whatever. And I was curious if you had any poetry on you or near you that you wanted to share with listeners.
I mean, both. You caught me at my desk, so I have. Let's just see first how much poetry I really have with me. So I have, here's a literary magazine, and here are one, two, three, four, five books of poetry here in this stack. There are two more books of poetry there. There's some poetry printed out for a Zoom meeting that I have in a little bit, and another chapter of poetry here. And I have my wallet, which has poetry in it. So that's you caught me. This was a good thing to be caught at. And I'll just take one out. I'm trying to find one that's not too long. Oh yeah, this is great. This is Encounter by Cecil Milos. Encounter. We were riding through frozen fields in a wagon at dawn. A red wing rose in the darkness, and suddenly a hare ran across the road. One of us pointed to it with his hand. That was long ago. Today, neither of them is alive, not the hare nor the man who made the gesture. Oh, my love, where are they? Where are they going? The flash of a hand, streak of movement, rustle of pebbles. I asked not out of sorrow, but in wonder. Not out of sorrow, but in wonder.
Oh, that was wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for letting our imaginations run wild in a very Daniel Handler, Lemony Snicket kind of way.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Well, so I always like to end the show with just two things. One is, we've tackled a lot of stuff. Obviously, there's a million things we could talk about. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to throw out there?
I can't think of anything essential. No, I'm working on a big, long fiction project now, so I can't really, it'll be a while before anyone is reading it but B.
Okay, well, I'll give you a quick shout out, which is your most recent memoir, and then what else came out in 2024, and from what I understand, in hardcover, and from what I understand, this fall we have a paperback version coming out. Which, if you want to hear Daniel Handler referring to himself as a lunatic after sharing an anecdote about lunatics working on the 2004 film, it's well worth reading. And then, for people who are interested in your work, interested in you, where's the best place to follow you online?
I guess Instagram. I am on Instagram where I am often posting stanzas of poetry. So if you'd like a stanza of poetry, the occasional odd photograph, but mostly stanzas of poetry, if you'd like that running across your feed, by all means do that.
Awesome. Well, that went really quick, so I'm going to throw another what else in there if you don't mind, which
Okay.
is one of the things while researching you that I discovered is that you and I are both devoted, loving, influenced fans of Roald Dahl. And I was curious about, like, because I don't actually know what the influence is for you, but one of the things that I always appreciate about Roald Dahl is the fact that everybody thinks about him as just being a children's writer, but he had a very prolific, like adult short story writing career and whatever.
Yeah.
And I was curious about like what the sort of most potent elements of Roald Dahl's career that you feel have influenced you are.
I mean, I think it is his children's literature. His voice in children's literature is the voice of someone telling you a story. It isn't just telling you it isn't, the book isn't telling you a story. The book is about someone telling you a story. And um, I think some of his hallmarks, he says things like, you and I would never say this to a woman, but this person went and said this terrible thing. And that feels quite Snickety to me. Um, and I also think he was fearless about um, his own curiosity. He was really interested in kind of human nastiness. And I would say that's not a huge interest of mine, but I like that he was just unafraid to go to those places. His reputation in modern days has suffered as a result of it. Um, and I don't find a convincing case that he's someone to be shunned. I think there's a case has been made that like we might not have had a great time hanging out with him in person, but we're not hanging out with him in person, and we never will. And so, but I think that one reason why people have a strong opinion about him now is that he was unafraid to look at human nastiness.
And he took a lot of risks in his writing because of it.
Yeah, I just think I mean, I think he had a lot of instinct, and I think that uh, he also he found a place kind of unexpectedly in children's literature where um, where that was less objectionable, oddly, than in his adult fiction.
Well, Danielle, unfortunately, we'll never hang out with Roald Dahl, but it's been a delight hanging out with you. So thanks so much for making space today.
Thank you. Very nice to have this conversation with you.
So, is anybody questioning their identity yet? Did I just talk with Daniel Snicket or maybe Lemony Handler? I'm still unsure, but I can tell you that that was a joyous and wonderful occasion. Daniel, thank you so much for being on the show. I now am adding San Francisco to my tourist journey goals, hopefully in the near future, so we can go swim in, a beautiful reservoir of water, and then I can see all the deliciousness because apparently, as you've described it, San Francisco has the best cafes. So thank you so much for coming on the show. And for listeners at home who are interested in kind of part two of this interview, I strongly encourage picking up And Then What Else. It's just a nice casual view into the creative procedures and the journey that Daniel has gone through throughout the years. Moving ahead, I'm excited to have another writer on the show for episode 46. On April 23rd, Lee Ellen Hickey is going to be on the show. Lee Ellen is somebody who has written a really cool historical fiction novel called Girl in the Glass Coffin, The Tonkin Affairs, which takes place in Oswego, New York, which, if you're unfamiliar, is located on Lake Ontario at the, a northern part of New York State. But the Tonkin Affairs is a sort of fascinating story about Virginia Tonkin, who was a 10-year-old girl who passed away in the late 1800s, whose family found a very unique way to remember her by having her embalmed and then put into a glass coffin and kept in their home for well over a year. It kind of fits with the strange, dark vibe of a series of unfortunate events, but it's a really cool book that Lee has spent her time researching and putting forward in order to recontextualize some lore that has existed within Oswego. So if you're somebody who is interested in local history, if you're interested in writing, if you're interested in self-publishing, tune in on April 23rd for my interview with Lee Ellen Hickey. If you're interested in checking out more amazing literary interviews, I strongly suggest checking out the back catalog of Meditations with Ryan Zlomek. I don't just interview authors or people associated with authors, but I have an unhealthy love of reading, and I would encourage you to go check out episodes like episode 27 with Soma Mae Shung Fraser, the writer of Off the Books, a phenomenal first novel, and I'd like to give Soma a shout out for kindly connecting me and Daniel Handler to make this interview happen. Equally, on episode 32, you can check out an interview with Jen Gunnels, who's an editor of Tor Books, focusing on making sure that science fiction and horror enter the literary landscape. Or episode 36 with the author of Wicked, Gregor Maguire, talking about how we recontextualize just stresses we have in our lives into novels and how he recontextualized the Wicked Witch of the West for all of us. And then episode 37 with horror author Grady Hendrix, writer of My Best Friend's Exorcism and most recently Witchcraft for Wayward Girls, about the way in which we force ourselves to write and, consider audience in our writing. All those bring me great joy, and I strongly suggest giving them a listen. If you're interested in finding out more about me, Ryan Zlomek, you can find The World of Ryan Zlomek on Facebook. You can find at Ryan Zlomek on Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky, or you can email me, meditations@ryanzlomek.com. I just want to know what brings you joy. If you're interested in helping out the show, there are a bazillion ways to spread the word, but I will narrow it down to 3. Number 1, kindly share your experience with somebody. Just talk about the show. Talk about something you learned during this interview. Number 2, share it on social media. Throw it up on whatever platform you're most comfortable with and see how people online react to it. And 3, go on your favorite podcast platform, whether it be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or some other venue, and write a review of the show. Give it 5 stars so that more people are apt to listen. As much as we hate to acknowledge that the algorithm, in air quotes, is something that we live by, 5-star reviews truly help put cool podcasts like this one onto the radar of people who may not have seen it otherwise. But as always, it's more important that you go out and spread positivity in the world. Thanks for listening. I truly appreciate your support, and don't forget to make space for conversation because you just might learn something. Have an awesome week. Whether it be fortunate or unfortunate, I'm sure it'll be awesome.